Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'm finally getting around to make my sequel video to my top 10 worst players of all time for Survivor US. And here I'll be ranking the top 10 worst players to make the merge. Again, with Survivor, the people at the bottom of my list of the players of all time are typically players that were taken out the first opportunity. This list obviously narrows that group down to people that at least had some longevity in the game. So I will preface this with a few ground rules here. First, there will be no players that were voted out in the pre-jury and then came back into the game. So players like Lil Morris, people like Matt Elrod, they will not be included. Also, again, obviously this is a video about the merge, not the jury. So players that were voted out pre-merge but still made the jury won't be on here. People like Elise Linares is a good example of that. And also, I probably should mention that, I do feel like some really notable worst players of all time are not going to be on this list. Even for people that made the merge, it's still going to be largely a group of players who were never part of a core majority group. So while there may be certain other players I think made, dumber individual moves, that won't quite qualify them to be a top 10 worst player. And with that, let's just jump right into honorable mentions, which again, I will handle in a similar way that I did in my worst player video, where I have a decent amount of honorable mentions here. There are a lot of different groupings of players that are pretty similar. Starting that off with a group of players that, again, I think made dumb individual moves, but are not necessarily the worst players in the grand scheme of things, with Eric Reichenbach being a major example of that. Obviously, again, him giving up immunity, really dumb move, one of the dumbest moves in all of Survivor, but does not make him a top 10 worst player, especially considering he made it to the end game with win equity 2 times. And also in this subgroup, again, a James Clement is someone that didn't quite make the list despite his dumb move, but again, I think he's someone that is a pretty consistent player. Sebastian from Ghost Island is another one I think is not actively bad enough. Brandon Quinton and Christy Smith both made pretty dumb moves, but again, not quite on the level of the top 10 worst to me. Obviously, another notable figure we have to mention here is Brandon Hance, who gives up immunity, really dumb move there, and then obviously has his run in Karamoan, which is really bad. But the thing that kept him off the list here was really his win equity. Where on South Pacific, outside of Ozzy, he was the biggest jury threat on the board. He was going to beat literally everybody from Upolu, which that alone leaves him off the top 10 to me. Next grouping of players here are all people that were pretty much goats in the game, but were all at least in some sort of majority group at one point. So obviously Natalie Tenorelli is a major example of that. Someone that really couldn't win the game, someone that was so closely attached to Boston Rob the entire way, but at least she had that. And the same thing goes for players like a Cassandra from Fiji, or a Denise from China, or even a Courtney Merritt from Panama, Purple Kelly, Cat from One World. All these players are players that, again, didn't really have the greatest win equity, but at least were part of the core majority group at one point across the season. Also, I feel like I have to mention Zoe, who is someone that always sticks out to my mind as one of the worst players to make the merge, but surprisingly did not make the list here. Largely because, again, at least she was involved in the Road to 4. That is something. And also she had the wherewithal to flip on the Road to 4 once she recognized that they were out of power. So again, at least those are some minor positives for Zoe. I guess also in relation to that previous grouping of people I would perceive as GOATs, we also have a grouping here of people who I don't think are good players, but at least had win equity in the game. I think a Susie Smith is an example of that. Came 1 vote away from winning. A Jan from Survivor Thailand is an example. Lydia from Guatemala. Dan Lembo from Nicaragua is an example, where at least they had win equity. Dan Lembo in particular is someone that I really wanted to put in the top 10, but he does win if he gets to the end. Beats, I think, everyone but Fabio if he gets to the end. So at least that's something. So again, did not quite make the list. But then we get to some of the more problematic figures to make the merge. People like a Frank or a Roger, who again did not quite make the top 10, largely because at least they had their own backings. Like Roger had solid allies in Butch and Dave. Frank had solid allies in T-Bird and Carl and Linda. So again, at least that's something. obviously we got to mention Varner, and Varner was a really interesting case here where there's obviously a serious argument for him making it. He's played 3 times now. He's only made the merge once, and even then barely, being the merge boot, not even making the jury. But again, obviously Varner is a very unlikable person in the modern day, but I do think when we're assessing his actual gameplay, I do think he gets very unlucky at many points. While he doesn't play the merge particularly well in Australian Outback, I think he was playing pretty well up to that point, being one of the more strategic thinkers on that cast. On Cambodia, again, I think he starts off pretty well, but then gets swapped into the physically weakest tribe there that doesn't get any supplies. And I think that was an element of luck. And then obviously just straight up gets swap screwed on Game Changers. That leads to the entire Zeke situation. So it's like, I think there are just a lot of unlucky circumstances for Varner to where there is that potential there, but he's never really been able to properly show it. But because it's still there, he didn't quite make the top 10. But beyond that, we obviously have even more icky figures in Dan Foley, Will Sims, obviously Dan Spilo. And again, with all 3 of these people, they were in majority alliances after a merge. I would say Dan Foley is the one that was probably the closest to me to making the list, where I feel like Dan Foley makes more actively bad decisions along the way, to where, again, like I could definitely argue him being on the list, but did not quite make it. Will, to me, is someone that I think his game gets a bit too trashed on, especially because he came in the final tribal getting 3 out of 8 votes and was also able to integrate himself within the majority group despite being the only no caller in that group. So again, Will wasn't really that close, and Dan Spilo was also someone that was in lockstep with Tommy, the person that did run the game, to where, again, like despite the ickiness there, again, not quite someone that is in the top 10 worst. Now moving forward, I do feel like we have some people that were kind of social pariahs at the time of the merge. I mean, we have a couple of merge boots and Clarence and Elizabeth, who by the time of the merge were just easy consensus targets. So again, they were in consideration, but I do feel like both of them have a level of potential to where they didn't quite make the list. Also, we got other social pariahs in people like a Karishma or a Shireen or even a Sierra from Token Sheens, who again also were in consideration, with Sierra probably being the person I was most apt to put on the list, considering I do feel like Shireen and Karishma at least have a decent amount of strategic ability, but I just didn't feel like they were actively bad enough. Also consider Jean Robert, because it was John Robert. Also consider some other merge boots that never attended a tribal and got voted out the first opportunity. People like a Kobe, who technically attended one tribal, but still. RC, and I think the most notable one here being Chris Noble, who, again, coming into this, I really thought Chris Noble was going to make the top 10. However, I think with Chris Noble in particular, the big difference for me is that, again, like he had a decent backing with him on the initial Navidi, where, again, Navidi was split 5v5 with half the tribe backing Chris Noble. And I feel like that alone is something that is pretty impressive, especially when he's facing off against Dominic and Wendell. The fact that he was able to create this opposition alliance to Dominic and Wendell is pretty impressive. The problem is that obviously the swaps don't work out in his favor, and then he obviously plays the merge round poorly, but I feel like there's at least some pros along the way, and also the fact that I think he's so good at challenges that he's probably one of these people that is rarely going to go to tribal in the pre-merge anyway, to where, again, he didn't quite make the list. Did also consider a couple of people that did like quit the game immediately after a merge, like a Janu or a Julie. With, for me, Janu probably being closer to making the list, where to me, Julie at least is someone that I saw the potential there. The problem is I don't think the motivation to play the game was there. While Janu, I don't think the potential was there, but again, still did not quite make the list due to there not being as much actively bad with Janu in my eyes. Also, didn't end up including any multi-time players, despite there being some considerations. Obviously, Philip Shepard is someone that comes to mind. And along with that, other like similar goats and people like a Scoopin or Sugar, who are in like these Kingmaker positions. Again, didn't quite put them on the list just because, one, I mean, they were still able to make it to the end, and also demonstrate some level of control across their seasons, especially Philip, if we're talking about Karamoan. So again, at least that's something. Joe Anglam is someone I really considered, considering while he is someone that has a lot of win equity, he's obviously never gonna get there. With him now playing 3 times, and he's rarely voted correctly, and he's also rarely survived a round without immunity. It's like, that's all really bad, but I think that inherent win equity is something that's high enough to where he doesn't quite make the list. Also consider someone like an Abby Maria, who if she hadn't appeared twice and got similar results both times, she probably would be on the list. But I mean, to be fair, she was also like part of the core majority alliance initially on Philippines. But again, definitely not a player I look at too highly. Also considered someone like a Cass and like Shambo, I would consider similarly, though obviously Cass is more strategic. But these people that flipped in the game, flipped against their initial tribe and does so in a way that burns jury votes. Again, like I think Cass, no matter how much she tries to defend it after the fact, I still think her move to flip at the merge at Cagayan is a really dumb move. And I think Cass really plays terribly across Survivor Cagayan. But I do think she turned it around a bit in Cambodia, and also just inherently has a decent amount of strategic ability to where she didn't quite make the list. Also considered some people from 42, with probably Lydia being the one that was closest to making the list, considering she was almost voted out at the first tribal she attends. Doesn't end up getting voted out largely due to things completely out of her control, but again, she was at least part of the initial majority at the merge and kind of gets screwed over by Hourglass, so again, didn't quite make it. And then these last two are probably literally number 11 and 12 on this list. First one being a player from Survivor One World, to where, spoiler, I have 3 people already on the list from Survivor One World, but this person was very close to making it on. That person is Michael Jefferson, who I do think is pretty bad. I mean, he was part of like Matt Quinlan's alliance that gets flipped on immediately the first time they go to tribal. Is kind of just on the outs for a lot of the game and eventually gets blindsided the second vote after the merge. However, I do feel like he probably demonstrated a bit more potential than anyone that made it into the top 10, particularly in him being part of the initial majority after the merge for that first round. But again, still all around mostly a mediocre player. And also the last person to mention here is Nora, who was literally on the list right before I started recording this video. And a lot of that comes from the fact that I decided that I'm not going to include any finalists in the top 10. Again, Nora was someone that was barely on the list anyway, but I think the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I might as well just make this entire top 10 non-finalist, as I feel like Nora is debatable on whether or not she's on the list or not. I feel like Nora is someone that I have very little faith in her overall game ability. I feel like she's someone that could be an early boot on certain seasons, but I think most of the time she probably does have a deep run, but is almost always a go at the end. I don't know if ever gets the respect to win the game, but considering how consistent I feel like she is in probably getting to the end and losing, I feel like that's good enough to not quite make the list. But again, still don't look too highly at Nora. But with that, we are at the top 10, the top 10 worst players to make the merge. Let's start off at number 10. We are starting off with a player from Survivor One World, and here we do have Tarzan. And Tarzan was an interesting case to me, where I will be honest, Tarzan was not someone that was really on my radar of being a top 10 player until pretty late into this process. Because I feel like for me, with Tarzan, despite him having very little win equity, I did always find it impressive that he is able to be the last guy standing on this season, where obviously the women dominate. And even through that survives past where Kat gets voted out, almost got into a position where he was going to get the 3 with Alicia and Christina. I mean, that's at least some impressive maneuvering there. Also, he was part of the initial majority alliance on his original tribe with Colton. So again, those are some positives. The problem is pretty much everything else. I think just Tarzan all around is not the greatest player socially. He's not all there strategically. I do think the way he handles Jonas in his boot round is really terrible. And really, his jury management as a whole is not particularly great, though, I mean, to be honest, I don't know if Tarzan's ever really winning a jury vote anyway. And the fact that he can barely remember the players' names while out there and never actively seems to make true decisions across the game, again, it is pretty bad. But again, there is some decent positioning at points. And considering he was facing off against Kim Spradlin, and Kim Spradlin is the one to convince Alicia and Christina to vote him out at 6, is also probably a thing that doesn't knock him too much. But with that, he does end up landing here number 10. Now, number 9, another player from Survivor One World, a player that I've already mentioned in this video. We do have Christina Cha. And Christina, for me, is the player that's in this top 10 that I think has the most potential to move up if they were to return. I feel like Christina is a player that I don't think is fundamentally bad in the game. I think just her one appearance in One World was really bad, to the point where, like, with that being the only one that I can base her game off of, I do have to land her this low. But I do feel like if she were to play again, I could definitely see her playing a much better game and get off of this top 10 worst list. Christina is a player that was never truly part of the core alliance. I mean, yes, she was part of this women's group that did dominate the post-merge, but she was never really well positioned within that. I mean, she was even part of that initial alliance in the pre-merge, where she was one of the potential boots early on. She does have an actively hostile relationship with Alicia early on, where while they do repair that by the time of the merge, I do feel like she does some pretty bad work in managing that relationship there. She was someone that was probably going home had they gone to tribal again after the swap, to where if it wasn't for Colton's medevac, she probably ends up going home. And also, again, like, after the merge, it's like, while she is voting with these women, she's probably the least important to that overall alliance, where Kim has her solid 3 with Sabrina and Chelsea. Kim and Alicia obviously have a really great relationship, but Christina is just kind of there, just voting alongside Alicia throughout the entire post-merge, never truly making a decision for herself, and then kind of just gives up at the end, in a position where she loses even if she gets to the end, where none of the jury members had any respect for Christina. So I really don't have much positive to say about Christina, but I do think there is probably a semblance of potential there, with Christina just seeming like a intelligent person in real life. It's just that didn't seem like it translated much to the game of Survivor. But again, for me at this point, I do have her at number 9. Now, number 8 is a player that comes from Survivor Palau, again, a season where there was no technical merge, but again, I am considering the merge at the point where Stephanie joins Kror. And the worst player from the post-merge to me of Palau is Karen. And a lot of that is just because Karen sucks. I mean, really, Karen is someone that I do think you can credit certain things to her game. I mean, she does vote in the majority throughout her entire stint until she goes home. She is someone that does build a bond with Tom, to where Tom does keep her around for a few rounds longer than what she probably should have. And she does pick Willard to go on Kror, to the point where Willard is someone that is going to go home before her. So again, those are some minor positives. The problem is, again, everything else. I think she's someone that can't win a jury vote, and was someone that no one actually wanted to take to the end, despite the fact that she was such a blatant goat. Plus also the fact that she kind of ruins the plans to flip the game on some of the bigger names in the game, where again, there's this plan to take out Tom and Ian, and she doesn't go along with it. And to a fair part of that is because of her relationship with Tom. But considering her only winning scenario is maybe getting in the end Katie, she really wasn't playing the game to win. Really, Karen's just a person who's kind of on the outs for a lot of the season, but does have like minor positives to keep her off of being higher on the list. So she is here at number 8. Now, number 7 is a player that always stuck out to my mind as one of the worst players to make the merge. So I'm surprised they're not a bit higher, but at number 7, we do have Angela from Survivor Ghost Island. And Angela, to me, is a player that really is never in the majority group throughout the entire season, despite her getting all the way to 4th place. She is someone that, while she's aligned with Chris Noble, which again, 5v5 at the time that they get to the first swap, she's almost the boot at the first vote after swap. Now, I will say that technically, if Chris Noble did not get exiled, Chris would have been the boot there. But, I mean, like, we literally almost saw her getting blindsided by her own group. That's not great. At the time of the merge, she's blindsided by the Chris vote. And following that, she's kind of just on the outs. Like, she's never really part of the majority Navidi group, but it's kind of just riding alongside them when all other players are being taken out as the bigger threats. I mean, we have people like a Michael Yerger and a Chelsea and a Kellen being taken out just because they're bigger threats than Angela. Like, who really cares about Angela at this point in the game? Well, we have players like Desiree and Chelsea and Kellen all going out in positions where Angela was aligned with those players. I mean, even at the final 6, where they could have potentially made a move against Dominic, Angela ends up stopping that plan, telling Dominic what's going on, in a position where that greatly disfavors her, only for her to get to the final 4 round where Dominic doesn't even decide to save her at that point, makes her go into fire making against Wendell, which she ends up losing. Again, she's really just never in the majority throughout the entire season. Doesn't have much win equity on the season, considering Dom and Wendell were always going to win if they get to the end. And really didn't have a true clue of what was going on for a lot of the game. But, I mean, the reason she's not higher on the list is because, one, longevity. I mean, she is there up until the Final Four. Also, the fact that she just survives as many tribals as she goes to, where I believe on this list she is the person that survived the most number of tribals. Maybe there's another person that beats her, but Angela at least voted correctly more than that other person, who we'll get to. But for me, it's enough to land Angela here at number 7. On number 6, we're moving on to the only player on this list from pre-All-Stars, and here we do have Shawn Caniff. And Shawn is a player that obviously his entire legacy is kind of revolved around this alphabet strategy and him kind of being this doofus in the game, where again, he has this strategy of obviously voting out people alphabetically. And that's a plan that the Taki Alliance ends up using to take out the Pagongs in a way that Shawn did not anticipate. But really, Shawn's a person that has no respect across the season. He's someone that I don't think beats anybody in a jury vote. I mean, maybe Sue, but even then. I mean, Shawn is someone that is so openly talked about as someone that the Pagongs have no respect for how he's playing the game because of how he's playing alphabetically. The Toggies don't like him as he's someone that comes off as a massive doofus. Like, I don't know who respects Shawn in this game to ever give Shawn the win. Obviously, the alphabet strategy just completely backfires on him. But also, I feel like a thing that we have to put into context with Shawn, though, is Shawn's reason for being on the show, where Shawn comes on to Survivor with the intention of getting some publicity so that he can get like a talk show, where Shawn is someone that wanted to like become famous. And I think a lot of the way he plays the game on this season is based around the fact of him trying to make himself come off as likable. Now, obviously, all that backfires, where again, he comes off as an idiot. But I do think that leaves it open to where, like, I don't know if Shawn is really the worst player in the world, where, like, I think if he were to play again, which I don't think he wants to, but if he were, then, like, maybe there's a chance he could shake things up. And, like, Shawn is someone that is, like, intelligent in real life. Like, he is a doctor. So, like, I'm sure he's not as doofusy as he comes off on the show, but based on what we've seen, he never truly gets what he wants across the season, with his own plans backfiring on him and him not having respect from the jury. So I don't know how much there really is to praise here. He is here in number 6. Now, number 5, we're moving on to a player that I kind of look similarly to Shawn, but this person being a much more modern player, and that player is Taylor from Survivor Millennials versus Gen X. And Taylor's, like, again, kind of a similar figure, kind of like this doofusy sort of guy, but also someone that is instantly targeted at the merge, unlike Shawn, where, again, Shawn has longevity in the game. Taylor's vote out the second vote after the merge, in a position where he was going to be the first vote out, but then they decided to switch to Michelle to avoid an idol, and is voted out second on his tribe, with his tribe actively hating him because he was stealing food. His entire food stealing debacle is something that really tarnishes his jury chances, to where I can't imagine a world where Taylor wins the game if he gets to the end, considering how much the other players seem to be repulsed by what he was doing there. But also the fact that, again, like before that, he was also blindsided at the Figgy vote, didn't know what was happening there. He was part of the initial majority where him, Figgy, Jay, and Michelle do successfully pull over Will and Michaela to vote out Mari. But, I mean, Taylor had very little to do with that. But, I mean, really, it is that one vote that does keep him off of being much higher on the list, where I do think there is a lot of similarities between Taylor here and the top 2 people on the list. But at least with Taylor, there was a point where he was part of a majority group, so at least that's something. But I do think the rest of this game is pretty actively bad, and because of that, he is here at number 5. Now, number 4 is a player that is kind of similar to Taylor in terms of overall trajectory and positioning in the game, and that person is Morgan from Survivor Cagayan. Again, I think Morgan actually has a very similar game to Taylor. She is someone that is the second boot after the merge, in a position where she's not respected by the rest of the tribe. She's looked at someone that's not helping around camp. She is someone that's also outside the majority group at a point in the pre-swap where she is obviously aligned with Bryce in the eventual Bryce boot, but then is part of the majority when they vote out Alexis, and does seem to be part of the core at that point, with the brains kind of picking her up. So again, like for me, her and Taylor are very similar trajectories. I feel like the difference here is that I feel like Taylor is someone that I think has more potential if he were to return than Morgan, where like I don't think Morgan ever does well and ever has respect from a jury, where like I can at least see a world where Taylor does. Also, I feel like Taylor was more actively in putting himself in the good position when he was in a good position, where at least he does build these bonds with Jay and Figgy that does put him in a good position early on. While with Morgan, the time that she is in a good position is where she's swapped into a position where the brains already hold a lot of the numbers, and she's just kind of picked up by them. To where, like, I don't think it was as much active work from Morgan. So again, like, I think those are like minor differences for me that do leave Morgan here at number 4. Now, number 3, we're getting to the final player from Survivor One World, a player that I always knew was going to be very high on this list, and that player is Leaf. I'm actually kind of surprised Leaf is not number 1. I always look at Leaf as a really terrible player. But, I mean, a minor pro for Leaf is the fact that he was in the initial majority alliance where he was aligned with Colton, and they do vote out Matt. Now, by the time of the Bill vote, he already starts to play pretty actively bad, where he's like telling people that they're going home, and through that, his own alliance considers taking him out, but they eventually flip the vote to vote out Bill. But again, that's already pretty bad. After the merge, he's kind of just clueless a lot of the way. He's the only person to not vote out Jonas. He also doesn't end up siding with Troyzan in the round where Troyzan plays his idol, where, I mean, yes, the women do rearrange the split vote to where Jay would have gone home anyway, but for Leaf, it was definitely a position where it was beneficial for him to flip there. I think just in general, socially, Leaf was not a good player. It doesn't seem like most people really connected to Leaf, to the point where Kim Spradlin herself says Leaf is pretty much the only person she was not able to bond with while out there. And again, for Kim Spradlin, someone that was able to bond with pretty much everyone on the cast, for not to be able to bond with Leaf, I feel like it's probably an indicator of Leaf's poor social play. So again, I think there's a lot actively bad with Leaf, but the thing that's keeping him out of the top 2 spots is the fact that he was part of Colton's alliance, and through that does vote in the majority for the entire pre-merge. So while I do think most of his post-merge is pretty bad, I think even his pre-merge is pretty bad, it's at least good enough to leave him off the top 2. But now we're moving on to number 2, and for me, these top 2 did end up being pretty definitive. I do feel like these are the 2 worst players to make the merge. And at number 2, we have the player that I referenced earlier when talking about Angela, where we're having another 4th place finisher, another person who was outside the majority group the entire season, another person that very rarely votes in the majority, and that person is Eddie Fox. And again, Eddie has a really insane voting record where, he very rarely votes correctly. Despite all the tribals he ends up going to in the pre-merge, the only time he votes correctly is during the Laura vote out, where it was a unanimous vote. But again, votes incorrectly when Allie goes home and when Hope goes home. Again, indicator of, like, again, he was outside of the majority alliance there. He was part of that 4-person alliance that instantly ends up down in numbers and really gets kept around just due to his physical strength. After a merge, he's again already back down in numbers, where Corinne goes home in a position where he was aligned with her. Final 11, Michael Snow goes home in a position where he votes outside of the majority. He does vote out Phillip, but again, that was due to idol plays. We're in a position if Malcolm didn't play one of his idols for Eddie, Eddie would have gone home in there. He then votes incorrectly on the initial vote when Malcolm goes home, though does flip his vote to vote out Malcolm. Again, one of his closest allies, one of the only time he does vote correctly on a revote. And then again, is completely on the outs when Reynolds goes home. Despite Andrea being blindside, he's not added to that plan, actually voting with Andrea there. During the Brenda blindside, he's once again not involved in the plan in what ends up being a 3-2-1, and is eventually voted out right before the final tribal in a position where he doesn't win the game even if he survives that, where Cochran was always winning the game. If he got to the end, and even in a Dawn, Sherry, Eddie final 3, I'm inclined to think that Dawn would win that based on how jury members have talked, to where it does seem like Eddie was only ever getting Reynolds' vote, and that's literally it. So again, there's really not much to praise from Eddie's game, but considering his longevity in the game, and considering I think he probably gets far in the game almost every time he plays, just off the fact that he's a pretty chill guy, that's enough that he ends up being on the list. And really, his Caramone game's so bad that he has to be here at number 2. Now, number 1, the worst player to me to make the merge, wasn't really that close by the end of it. I mean, it is a player that was outside of the majority alliance the entire time he was in the game. He only votes correctly 1 time across 5 tribals that he ends up going to, and that 1 time was in a position where it was self-preservation mode, where it was him or the other person. So worst player to make the merge to me is Jason Siska from Survivor Micronesia. And again, to me, Jason is a player that, like, on paper is already really bad. But I think when we add in what we've heard about him after the show, where supposedly he was just a massive dick to his entire tribe, that really does recontextualize it to where I think at this point he's the definitive worst person on this list. Where if we're talking about him being this massive doofus, but then also him being someone that was not liked by his tribe because he treated a lot of them poorly. That's really bad in its own right. But also just looking at, again, his voting record and his position in the game. His initial tribe goes to tribal twice before the merge. Both times he votes out Chet, and both times he fails to vote out Chet. After the swap, he does build a relationship with Eliza, but again, Eliza's another person that's already on the outs, and him and Eliza are really on the bottom from that point forward. And Eliza is voted out at the merge in the position where he wins immunity, and he probably would have been voted out had that not been the case. He obviously has the fake idol from Ozzy and does believe it's real, gives it to Eliza. That's also really humorous. He obviously survives the eventual Ozzy boot, that being the only time he does vote correctly. But again, that was self-preservation mode, and even then he wasn't really that looped in on the plan. It's just that he was always voting for Ozzy because that's who he perceived to be his biggest threat in the game. But then beyond that, the very next round, he genuinely finds an idol, only for him to be blindsided despite having the idol in his pocket, and despite someone like a James being more adversarial to the players in control at that point, where James is like actively targeting Parvati. And despite that, the likes of Natalie and Alexis, these people that do have relationships with Jason, still decide to vote him out. And yes, I know they do vote James, but again, it was a split vote anyway. So again, like, I think as a whole, I mean, Jason has very little to praise here, if anything. I mean, really, I just think his physical ability that keeps him safe early on, and also keeps him safe at the first tribal after the merge, and then also his ability to find an idol, which could have potentially saved him had he played the idol. But I mean, really, I just think he's a terrible player. From a social standpoint, where it seemed like no one truly liked him and didn't have any respect by the time he left the game. And also strategically, he's blatantly bad, with him not really seeming to have that good of a grasp on the overall game. So again, not much positive to say about Jason. He is the worst player for me to make the merge. But there we go. That is my top 10 worst players to make the merge. Also, stay tuned for more Survivor rankings down the road as well, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.